Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 21st, 2023. Well, tomorrow will be the hopefully beginning of a new era of human history, but it's not going to happen by itself. It's going to require a mobilization of people around the world, especially in the global north, to break with the policies of perpetual warfare and perpetual colonialism, which are the desire of most of the world's population to break the control of the colonial powers. Now, the occurrence tomorrow will be the convening of the BRICS conference, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is going to be watched very closely by every nation in the world. There are expected to be at least 40 countries participating, and the agenda includes the request of 23 other nations to join the BRICS, join the 5 initiating powers. Secondly, plans for a new financial system for world trade outside of the dollar system, which is controlled by Wall Street and London and which is undergoing a collapse, which requires those who control that system to expand the looting, not just of the poorer countries, but even of the populations of their own nations. And the third part of the agenda is a campaign to lift all the nations of Africa out of poverty. This essentially would mean the end of the colonial system that's been controlled by Western nations for the last 400 to 600 years. They've exploited the nations of the global South over those centuries through exploitation of cheap raw materials, cheap resources, and cheap labor, including slave labor for a significant portion of that time of the colonial era. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, issued a memo to participants of the conference as well as to citizens of the global north, in which she welcomes their emergence out from under the conditions which have been imposed on them. She writes, quote, "We, the citizens of the global north, must wholeheartedly congratulate this development and support it through practical cooperation." She concludes by saying, quote, "We can help end the shameful phase of colonialism and begin a human chapter in universal history," unquote. I will include a link in the description section of today's update for you to read the statement yourself, circulate it, and to make other people aware of this momentous event, which is not going to be covered in any honest, truthful way in the Western media. In fact, the Western media is involved in a campaign to sabotage the conference. But Helga's statement, which is a powerful appeal to you and your neighbors and your friends and your coworkers to recognize that we don't have to accept the conditions of in the world today of perpetual war and austerity. We don't have to accept the leaders, the puppet leaders like Biden and Sunak and Macron and the NATO countries who are doing the bidding of the colonial powers. So what is also occurring at this point is it should be obvious to most governments of the global north that this conference does represent that kind of break, and that it's in the interests of those countries to break with the policies which include today inflation, deindustrialization, the green policy of Malthusian genocide, and so on. Now, the leaders of the countries of the global north, however, want to continue the policy of perpetual war. And that includes targeting any nation which steps outside of the line of the rules-based order. We see this with the Ukraine war, the targeting of Russia, the targeting going on now of China, attacks against the former government of Imran Khan in Pakistan, against Argentina by the International Monetary Fund, the attempt to launch new wars for colonial power, colonial control, I should say, in West Africa. We also had this absurd event of Biden hosting the leaders of South Korea and Japan to discuss the consolidation of an Asian NATO, which would be part of a global NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. How absurd is it to say that NATO has responsibility to control the strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, at the same time, it's becoming increasingly obvious to those outside of the delusional idiots like Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland and most of the U.S. Congress in both parties that the Ukrainian proxy war, which was designed to have a regime change in Russia, break apart Russia so that Russia could be looted by these Western powers, that proxy war has failed. I'll give you a couple of examples of the recognition. On August 19th, Politico had an article which reports that American officials now realize they missed an opportunity to push for peace talks when Ukraine initially had made some advances long before the so-called counteroffensive. And General Milley, who is the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that now would be a time to negotiate from a position of strength. Politico reports American officials saying that Milley had a point, that Ukrainian victory is, quote, unachievable. And the fact that this is in Politico, that there are leading officials, including military and intelligence officials, who believe that the time has come for negotiations, that's a change in itself. Then there's the latest Seymour Hersh article, in which Hersh writes that CIA officials had warned Blinken that the Ukrainian counteroffensive would fail and that Kiev could not win the war. This should have been obvious, and it was obvious to many, many people outside of the mainstream media. If you've been watching people like Scott Ritter, by the way, who's now been shut down by YouTube, or Colonel McGregor, or if you've been watching my updates, it's clear that it was a mistake to launch a counteroffensive. Even with all the weaponry NATO's advancing, it's a losing proposition that Russia will not lose this war. And yet they continued. Now, Blinken's attitude, like that of Nuland and the Warhawks, was summarized in the Washington Post by a military-industrial complex leaker by the name of David Ignatius. And he described the war in Ukraine as, quote, a strategic windfall at relatively low cost, other than for the Ukrainians, unquote. Now, he went on to say it was a triumphal summer for the alliance, the expansion of NATO, and so on. When it looked like NATO was going to crack, it didn't crack. But think about this statement, especially if you're Ukrainian, that he said this was a strategic windfall at relatively low cost, other than for the Ukrainians. He's dismissing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, the displacement of millions of Ukrainians, the deaths of the Russian soldiers in this, the disruption of the world economy, as a low cost for the goals of the Warhawks, which included the attempt to degrade and weaken Russia's military, which hasn't happened. Now, if open admissions such as this, which dismisses the deaths of all of these people, if something like this doesn't outrage you, you're not human. And Ignatius speaks for a section of the establishment, which is gloating that they're forcing Russia to spend enormous amounts of money and resources and human sacrifice to defend their nation, and that this was done without having American lives lost. Well, that's the insanity of the present strategic order, the so-called rules-based order, the unipolar order. That's why you should be celebrating its demise. Now, by celebrating its demise, I don't mean to say that a collapse will somehow magically make everything all right, but that's why you should pay attention to what's happening in South Africa the next 3 days with the BRICS summit. The move to a new strategic and development architecture, which we at the Schiller Institute have championed, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche has a 10-point proposal of principles to address it. We've been pushing this for the benefit of all mankind, and we now have co-thinkers throughout the world, people who want to escape this strategic situation of death and destruction and create a more human society for the benefit of all mankind. Join with us to realize that. Watch the updates the next few days and make sure you tell your friends that there is an alternative to sitting around and being depressed about the idiocy of Western leaders. So thanks for joining me, and I'll be back with you.